Stop. My son heard that. The Korean Mafia boss's voice echoed through the marble halls of his mansion with such raw disbelief that every bodyguard, housekeeper, and family advisor froze where they stood. For one impossible heartbeat, time itself seemed to stop. A crystal glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the polished floor, but no one looked down. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the small boy standing near the grand piano, his dark eyes wide with confusion, as if he had just discovered a world everyone else had accepted was forever closed to him. 5 minutes earlier, no one in that house would have believed such a moment could ever happen. Earlier that afternoon, the atmosphere inside Daniel Park's estate felt heavier than any storm cloud hanging over the Seattle skyline. The mansion overlooked nearly 12 acres of perfectly maintained gardens, imported stone fountains, and towering pine trees that shielded the property from curious neighbors. Yet all that wealth felt meaningless. Expensive paintings decorated every hallway. Rare sculptures filled every room. Luxury cars rested silently inside a climate-controlled garage. Daniel Park had spent years building an empire powerful enough to make politicians return his calls within minutes and business leaders wait patiently for his approval. Money had solved nearly every problem life had ever placed before him. But money had failed him where it mattered most. Earlier that morning, one of the country's leading pediatric hearing specialists had removed his glasses, folded his hands together, and quietly delivered the words Daniel refused to accept. Every available treatment had already been explored. Every respected expert had reached the same conclusion. His young son, Ethan Park, was unlikely to ever hear the world the way other children did. There was still hope for communication, the doctor explained gently, but expecting normal hearing would only deepen the family's heartbreak. Daniel had nodded without speaking. He thanked the physician with perfect manners before personally walking him to the front entrance. The moment the front door closed, however, the carefully controlled expression disappeared from his face. For the first time in years, the man feared throughout international business circles looked completely helpless. His security team pretended not to notice as he stood alone beside the enormous living room windows overlooking the gardens, staring into the distance without seeing anything. Employees moved through the mansion in near silence. Conversations became whispers. Even the kitchen staff closed cabinet doors more carefully than usual, as though loud sounds somehow felt disrespectful inside a house, where hearing itself had become the greatest source of pain. Ethan sat quietly in the music room, absent-mindedly spinning the wheel of a small wooden toy while sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. He rarely smiled anymore. He watched people's faces more than their voices, studying every expression with remarkable patience for a child his age. Daniel looked toward his son several times, but could never bring himself to walk across the room. Every glance reminded him of promises he could no longer keep, and somewhere nearby, moving almost invisibly through the enormous mansion with a basket of freshly folded laundry, Naomi Carter continued her work exactly as she had every day before, unnoticed by nearly everyone inside the house. Naomi Carter had worked inside the Park estate for almost 3 years, yet many guests could not have picked her out of a lineup. She arrived before sunrise every morning, organized the breakfast room, polished the long hallways until the marble reflected the chandeliers like still water, and quietly disappeared into the background before anyone thought to thank her. She never interrupted conversations, never offered opinions unless someone asked directly, and never behaved as though she wanted attention. Most employees believed she simply preferred a peaceful life. Others assumed she lacked the confidence to speak. Neither assumption was true. Naomi simply understood something that many people overlooked. When people believed you were invisible, they unknowingly revealed everything. That afternoon, while replacing fresh flowers in the music room, Naomi noticed Ethan sitting exactly where he had been earlier. The little boy gently rolled the wooden toy back and forth across the polished floor, watching its movement with deep concentration. She had seen him do this many times before, but today something felt different. She paused for only a second before continuing her work, careful not to disturb him. Then she noticed it. Ethan did not react when a heavy serving cart rattled across the hallway outside the room. He did not respond when a housekeeper accidentally dropped a stack of folded towels nearby. But a moment later, as sunlight shifted through the tall windows and touched the polished piano, Ethan's fingers suddenly stopped moving. It lasted less than a second. Most people would never have seen it. His eyes drifted toward one corner of the room, as though he had sensed something almost impossible to detect. Naomi quietly looked around. Nothing appeared unusual. The air conditioning hummed softly. Curtains moved slightly in the afternoon breeze. She said nothing. Instead, she finished arranging the flowers and calmly walked away, carrying the observation with her. During dinner preparation, she found herself replaying the moment again and again. She had no medical degree. She was not an audiologist or a specialist. She had never claimed to understand conditions that experienced physicians had spent decades studying. Still, she trusted careful observation. Small details often told larger stories if someone had the patience to notice them. Over the next hour, she watched Ethan from a respectful distance while performing her normal duties. Once again, she noticed tiny reactions that seemed almost accidental. His breathing changed slightly when sunlight reflected from the garden fountain through the glass. His attention shifted when certain vibrations traveled across the hardwood floor. The changes were subtle enough to escape everyone else because everyone else was looking for dramatic signs. Naomi was not. She was looking for patterns. As evening settled over the estate, Daniel Park remained locked inside his private office with advisors discussing business matters he could barely concentrate on. The doctors had spoken with certainty, and everyone inside the mansion accepted their conclusion as final. Everyone except one quiet housekeeper who carried folded linens through silent hallways while a single unanswered question continued echoing inside her mind. What if they had all been asking Ethan to respond in the wrong way the entire time? Naomi knew how unbelievable that thought sounded, so she kept it entirely to herself, choosing observation over argument while the rest of the household unknowingly moved closer to a moment that would challenge everything they believed. The following morning began with the same quiet routine that had settled over the Park estate since the doctor's visit. Breakfast was served exactly at 7:30. Security personnel rotated shifts with military precision. Gardeners trimmed hedges along the circular driveway, while luxury vehicles came and went through the front gates. From the outside, everything appeared perfectly normal. Inside, however, every member of the household carried the same invisible weight. Daniel Park barely touched his breakfast before leaving the dining room for another conference call. His advisors continued bringing him proposals, financial reports, and investment opportunities worth millions of dollars, but he dismissed each one within minutes. Numbers that once demanded his complete attention now felt meaningless. His thoughts always drifted back to Ethan. Meanwhile, Naomi Carter continued performing her responsibilities exactly as she always had. She collected fresh towels from the laundry room, replaced flowers throughout the mansion, and quietly dusted shelves lined with priceless artwork. No one suspected that her attention was focused almost entirely on the little boy. She never stared. She never hovered. Instead, she observed naturally whenever their paths crossed. Shortly before noon, Ethan wandered into the sunroom overlooking the gardens. A gentle summer breeze pushed against the glass while small birds gathered near the fountain outside. Naomi entered carrying a basket of neatly folded blankets and immediately noticed something familiar. Ethan was watching the ripples on the fountain with unusual concentration. She slowly placed the blankets onto a nearby chair without making unnecessary noise. As she stepped across the hardwood floor, one loose floorboard beneath an antique rug produced the faintest vibration. It was almost impossible to notice unless someone happened to step on that exact spot. Ethan's head lifted instantly. It was not a dramatic reaction. He did not speak or smile. He simply paused and turned a few inches toward the source before returning his attention to the window. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. This was the third time she had witnessed an almost identical response. She quietly tested her own memory instead of testing the child. She walked naturally across another section of the room. Nothing happened. A few moments later, she crossed the same loose board again while pretending to straighten the curtains. Once more, Ethan paused. It lasted less than a second, but this time Naomi knew she had not imagined it. She carefully left the room without saying a word. Throughout the afternoon, she replayed every observation in her mind. None of them proved the doctors wrong. None of them suggested a miracle. They only suggested that Ethan might be sensing the world differently than everyone expected. Naomi understood how dangerous assumptions could be. She had no intention of challenging experienced physicians based on a few quiet moments. Even so, she could not ignore what her own eyes had seen. Late that afternoon, she found Daniel standing alone beside the library windows. His shoulders looked heavier than ever. Naomi politely asked if he needed fresh coffee. He thanked her with a tired smile and quietly said no. She almost walked away. Her hand had already reached the doorknob when she stopped. For several long seconds, she debated whether she should remain silent like everyone expected or risk sounding foolish. Finally, she turned back toward Daniel with respectful hesitation and softly said, "Mr. Park, I know this may sound unusual, and I may be completely mistaken, but before anyone gives up on Ethan, would you allow me to show you something that I have quietly noticed?" Daniel Park did not answer immediately. He studied Naomi's face, searching for any sign that she was speaking out of sympathy instead of certainty. During the past several months, he had listened to world-renowned specialists, researchers, and therapists. Every conversation had ended with another careful explanation about expectations and acceptance. He had learned to recognize false hope, and he refused to let anyone offer it to his son. Yet there was something different about the quiet confidence in Naomi's voice. She was not making promises. She was not claiming to have a cure. She was simply asking for permission to show him an observation. After a long silence, Daniel slowly nodded. "You have 5 minutes," he said gently. "That is all." Naomi thanked him with a respectful smile and led him toward the sunroom, where Ethan often spent part of his afternoon. She explained every detail carefully so Daniel would understand that she had reached no conclusions. She described the loose floorboard beneath the antique rug, the tiny pauses she had witnessed, and the subtle moments when Ethan appeared to notice vibrations that everyone else ignored. Daniel listened politely, but his expression revealed deep skepticism. "Doctors have performed hundreds of tests," he replied quietly. "If something this simple mattered, they would have found it." Naomi nodded in agreement. "You may be right," she answered. "I only ask that you watch without expecting anything." Daniel folded his arms and stepped back near the doorway while Ethan continued looking through the tall windows toward the fountain outside. Naomi walked naturally across the room carrying a folded blanket, careful not to attract Ethan's attention. The first time she crossed the loose floorboard, a faint vibration traveled through the hardwood beneath the rug. Ethan remained focused on the garden. Daniel sighed softly, almost ready to end the conversation. Naomi did not appear disappointed. She calmly walked toward a nearby bookshelf, adjusted a decorative vase, then crossed the same section of flooring again from a different angle. This time, Ethan's fingers stopped moving for an instant. His head tilted ever so slightly before returning to the window. The movement was so small that most people would have dismissed it as coincidence. Daniel did not speak, but his eyes narrowed. Naomi remained silent. She wanted him to observe without influence. Nearly a minute passed before she crossed the same spot once more while pretending to straighten a curtain. Again, Ethan paused. Again, his attention shifted for the briefest moment toward the source beneath his feet rather than toward Naomi herself. Daniel slowly uncrossed his arms. For the first time since entering the room, uncertainty replaced disbelief. Could that happen by chance? He whispered almost to himself. Naomi answered honestly. Yes, it could. That is why I have never mentioned it until now. But I have seen similar reactions several times in different rooms under different circumstances. I thought perhaps Ethan is sensing patterns that everyone has been unintentionally overlooking. Daniel looked toward his son with a mixture of hope and caution unlike anything Naomi had seen before. He knew better than to mistake a possibility for a miracle. But he also knew that genuine breakthroughs often began with someone noticing what everyone else considered too small to matter. Without another word, he reached into his pocket, took out his phone, and quietly called Ethan's hearing specialist, asking if they could come to the estate one more time because there was something unusual that needed to be seen with fresh eyes. The hearing specialist arrived at the Park estate just before sunset carrying the same leather case he had brought only one day earlier. His expression was courteous but cautious. He had agreed to return out of respect for Daniel Park, although he privately believed the visit would simply provide reassurance rather than new answers. Daniel greeted him at the front entrance and briefly explained that one of the house staff had noticed a pattern no one else had recognized. The physician glanced toward Naomi with polite curiosity before following everyone into the sunroom. Ethan was already sitting near the window, quietly stacking smooth wooden blocks into careful little towers. The doctor watched him for several minutes without interrupting. Naomi remained near the doorway, saying nothing unless she was asked. She understood that this moment belonged to observation, not persuasion. Daniel repeated exactly what Naomi had shown him earlier and emphasized that he wanted the doctor to form his own opinion. The physician nodded and slowly walked around the room, examining the hardwood floor, the antique rug, and the surrounding furniture. He eventually discovered the loose floorboard Naomi had described. It produced only the slightest vibration when stepped on, so faint that most adults barely noticed it beneath their shoes. The doctor crossed it once while Ethan continued playing. Nothing happened. He looked toward Daniel with a gentle expression that suggested coincidence might still be the simplest explanation. Naomi remained completely calm. She had expected this. Quiet patterns rarely appeared on command. She softly asked whether they could simply wait instead of repeating the movement over and over. The doctor agreed. For several peaceful minutes, no one spoke. The mansion itself seemed unusually still. Sunlight drifted across the polished floor as the afternoon slowly faded into evening. Then one of the gardeners outside rolled a heavy watering cart across the stone path beside the fountain. The vibration traveled faintly through the foundation of the house. Ethan suddenly stopped stacking his blocks. His eyes shifted toward the window before slowly moving across the room, as if searching for the source of something he could sense but could not fully understand. The physician immediately noticed the change. Without saying a word, he quietly stepped onto the loose floorboard again. Ethan paused once more. It was subtle, but this time everyone in the room saw it happen with their own eyes. The doctor did not celebrate. Instead, he crouched beside Ethan with a warm smile and began performing several simple observational activities completely different from the earlier clinical evaluations. He gently tapped different surfaces around the room, changed positions, and watched Ethan's natural responses rather than asking him to complete structured tasks. Several minutes later, the physician slowly stood and looked toward Daniel with an expression that neither of them had shared in a very long time. "I cannot promise outcomes," he said carefully, "but I believe we may have been focusing almost entirely on one pathway while overlooking another." Ethan appears to recognize certain low-frequency vibrations and environmental cues more consistently than we realized. That observation deserves much closer evaluation. Daniel turned toward Naomi, unable to hide the emotion filling his eyes. She simply lowered her gaze with quiet humility. She had never claimed to know the answer. She had only trusted what patience had allowed her to see. For the first time since the frightening diagnosis, the silence inside the Park estate no longer felt like the silence of hopelessness. It felt like the silence that comes just before a new beginning. Over the next several weeks, the atmosphere inside the Park estate slowly began to change. The heavy silence that had once been filled with quiet despair was replaced by careful optimism. Daniel Park immediately arranged additional evaluations with specialists who focused on alternative hearing pathways, sensory integration, and early intervention techniques. Unlike the earlier appointments that concentrated almost entirely on what Ethan could not perceive, these sessions explored every subtle response his body naturally demonstrated. Each observation was documented with extraordinary care. Every small reaction mattered. Every tiny improvement became another piece of a much larger picture. Naomi continued living exactly as she always had. She still arrived before sunrise, prepared breakfast trays, polished the hallways, and quietly completed every responsibility without expecting recognition. She never inserted herself into medical discussions or family decisions. Whenever the specialists visited the estate, she respectfully stepped aside unless someone specifically asked what she had observed. Her humility impressed every professional who met her. She never described herself as the person who had found the answer because she believed the answer belonged to Ethan, not to her. She had simply noticed something that deserved another look. One afternoon, the lead specialist brought several carefully selected learning activities designed around vibration, visual attention, and environmental awareness rather than traditional sound recognition alone. Ethan responded with curiosity instead of frustration. For the first time in many months, his sessions felt less like exhausting examinations and more like enjoyable discoveries. Daniel watched from across the room, saying very little. Every smile that appeared on his son's face reminded him how close he had come to accepting that nothing more could be done. During one particular exercise, the specialist gently encouraged Ethan to place one hand against the polished surface of the grand piano while a musician lightly pressed several low keys. Ethan paused, smiled, and looked directly toward the instrument before placing his other hand beside the first. The response lasted only a moment, but it was unmistakably intentional. The specialist quietly smiled and wrote several notes before explaining that Ethan was demonstrating consistent awareness through multiple forms of sensory information working together. Progress would require patience, dedication, and realistic expectations, but there was now a meaningful direction to follow instead of a closed door. Daniel slowly exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for weeks. Later that evening, he found Naomi arranging fresh flowers in the main hallway. He thanked her once again, but this time his voice carried something deeper than gratitude. It carried respect. Naomi gently reminded him that Ethan deserved the credit because every child communicates in a unique way if adults are willing to slow down long enough to understand. Daniel stood silently for several seconds, reflecting on those words. Throughout his career, he had built an empire by making rapid decisions and demanding immediate results. Yet the most important lesson of his life had come from someone who succeeded simply by refusing to hurry past the smallest details. As the sun disappeared beyond the gardens, Ethan laughed softly while playing another learning activity with his therapist in the next room. It was not a dramatic transformation, nor was it a miracle that erased every challenge overnight. It was something far more meaningful. It was the beginning of genuine hope built on patience, careful observation, and the willingness of one quiet housekeeper to believe that what everyone else overlooked might still be worth seeing. Nearly 4 months passed before the specialist recommended trying a carefully designed listening session using Ethan's updated therapy plan. No one inside the Park estate spoke about it, as though they expected a miracle. They had learned that real progress rarely arrived in dramatic leaps. It arrived one patient step at a time. Even Daniel Park forced himself to keep his expectations realistic. The physicians had repeatedly reminded him that every improvement, no matter how small, represented meaningful progress. On the morning of the session, the music room had been quietly prepared with comfortable chairs, soft natural light, and specialized equipment adjusted specifically for Ethan's current abilities. The lead specialist reviewed the plan one final time, while another therapist carefully observed Ethan's expressions instead of focusing only on measurable data. Naomi remained in the background as she always did. She had finished arranging fresh flowers near the windows and quietly prepared to leave the room before the session began. Daniel noticed her movement and gently asked, "Please stay." She looked surprised but nodded respectfully before standing beside the doorway, without saying another word. Ethan sat comfortably near the grand piano with a relaxed smile that had become more common over the past several weeks. Instead of asking him to perform difficult tasks, the therapist encouraged him to enjoy familiar activities while gradually introducing carefully selected sounds paired with vibrations and visual cues he already understood. Minutes passed with only subtle responses. Ethan smiled at certain moments, paused thoughtfully at others, and occasionally turned his head with growing confidence. Every observation was carefully recorded, yet no one rushed to celebrate. Then something happened that no one had planned. Naomi was folding a clean linen cloth near the doorway when she accidentally allowed a small wooden picture frame resting on a nearby table to shift slightly. It produced a gentle tapping sound as it touched the polished surface beneath it. The sound itself was quiet, almost ordinary. Ethan suddenly stopped what he was doing. His eyes widened. Slowly, almost cautiously, he turned his head directly toward Naomi. The room became completely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. The lead specialist remained perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest interruption might influence what happened next. Naomi instinctively whispered, "I am sorry." Ethan blinked once, then smiled in her direction before taking 2 small steps toward her. Daniel stared in disbelief. The therapists exchanged stunned glances without speaking. The lead specialist softly repeated the same gentle sound from across the room, using another wooden object. Ethan turned again, this time even more confidently. Tears quietly filled Daniel's eyes as years of fear, disappointment, and unanswered questions suddenly gave way to something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope no longer existed only in careful medical reports or cautious professional opinions. It now lived inside a simple moment that everyone in the room had witnessed together. Daniel slowly looked toward Naomi. She stood frozen with tears in her own eyes, her hands still holding the folded linen cloth. She did not celebrate. She did not claim credit. She simply smiled at Ethan with the same quiet kindness she had shown him every single day, grateful that the little boy who had taught everyone the value of patience had just taken another extraordinary step toward a world that was finally beginning to open before him. The days that followed transformed the Park estate in ways no one could have imagined only a few months earlier. Specialists continued their evaluations with the same careful professionalism, but their conversations had changed completely. They no longer spoke about permanent limitations as though every possibility had already been exhausted. Instead, they discussed pathways, adaptation, neuroplasticity, and individualized learning strategies. Every new session was built around Ethan's unique responses rather than forcing him into a standard model designed for someone else. The lead specialist eventually gathered Daniel and several members of the therapy team in the library to explain what had become increasingly clear. Ethan had never been completely unreachable. Rather, his brain appeared to process certain sensory information differently, relying on combinations of subtle vibration, environmental awareness, visual timing, and gradually strengthening auditory perception. Traditional evaluations had measured what they expected to find. Naomi's quiet observations had encouraged everyone to look for what they had not expected. The physician smiled warmly as he admitted something that few experts found easy to say. Medicine depends on knowledge, he explained, but progress often begins with careful observation. Your housekeeper did not replace science. She reminded us to ask another question. Daniel listened without interrupting. Those words remained with him long after the meeting ended. Later that afternoon, he found Naomi quietly arranging fresh flowers in the entrance hall exactly as she had done hundreds of times before. Nothing about her routine had changed. She still worked with the same steady pace, never drawing attention to herself. Daniel walked toward her and asked a question that had been on his mind for weeks. How did you notice something that everyone else missed? Naomi gently smiled before placing the final flower into the vase. Because no one expected anything from me, she answered softly. When people are busy searching for big answers, they sometimes stop noticing the little ones. Ethan was always trying to tell us something. He simply was not using the language everyone expected. Daniel lowered his eyes as he reflected on every hurried decision he had made throughout his career. He had spent decades rewarding speed, efficiency, and certainty. Naomi had accomplished something extraordinary through patience alone. News of Ethan's progress quietly spread among the specialists involved in his care, not as a story about a miracle, but as an important reminder that every patient deserved individualized attention. Several members of the medical team later incorporated similar observational methods into future evaluations, hoping other families might benefit from the lesson Ethan had unknowingly taught them. Inside the mansion, however, life remained beautifully ordinary. Ethan laughed more often. He explored new activities with growing confidence. The music room that had once represented heartbreak gradually became his favorite place to learn. Naomi continued greeting him every morning with the same gentle smile, never expecting praise, never reminding anyone what she had contributed. Yet every member of the household now understood that the greatest turning point in Ethan's journey had not begun with expensive equipment or impressive titles. It had begun the moment one quiet woman chose to trust her eyes, remain humble enough to question her own assumptions, and care deeply enough to notice what everyone else had unknowingly walked past. Nearly 1 year later, the Park estate no longer felt like the place where silence had once carried the weight of heartbreak. Laughter now drifted through the hallways where whispered conversations had once filled every corner. Ethan continued making steady progress with the support of his therapists, his family, and countless hours of patient practice. His journey had never been about one miraculous afternoon that solved everything at once. It had been about hundreds of small victories built one careful step after another. Every new response, every new smile, and every new moment of confidence reminded Daniel Park that hope was strongest when it was nurtured with patience instead of demanded through certainty. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel invited everyone who had played a role in Ethan's progress to a quiet gathering inside the mansion. The therapists arrived. The physicians came as well. Members of the household stood respectfully near the back of the grand living room, assuming they had simply been asked to attend as part of the staff. Naomi quietly placed the final tray of refreshments onto a nearby table before preparing to excuse herself, believing her work for the day was finished. Before she could leave, Daniel gently called her name. She stopped, surprised that every person in the room had turned toward her. Daniel slowly walked across the polished floor until he stood directly in front of her. For a brief moment, the room became completely silent. The physicians who had spent decades studying medicine watched with quiet respect. The therapist who had guided Ethan through months of dedicated work smiled warmly. The security team stood motionless. Without saying a word, Daniel lowered his head in a deep, respectful bow toward Naomi. No one had ever seen the powerful businessman show such public humility. When he finally looked up, his voice remained calm, but filled with sincere gratitude. People often believe strength comes from power, wealth, or influence, he said. This past year taught me something completely different. Real strength belongs to the person who refuses to stop caring when everyone else believes there is nothing more to see. You reminded every one of us that observation, patience, and kindness can open doors that money alone never could. Naomi's eyes filled with quiet emotion, but she gently shook her head. Ethan did the hard work, she answered softly. The doctors never stopped searching. His therapists never stopped believing. I only noticed one small detail. The lead specialist smiled and replied before anyone else could speak. History often changes because someone notices one small detail. At that moment, Ethan walked across the room, carrying a simple drawing he had made during therapy. He looked at Naomi with a bright smile and clearly said, "Thank you." The words were gentle and carefully spoken, but they needed no explanation. Tears quietly filled every eye in the room. Naomi knelt beside him, accepted the drawing with both hands, and smiled as though it were the greatest gift she had ever received. Daniel looked around at everyone gathered inside his home and realized that the greatest lesson his son had given them was not about hearing at all. It was about learning to truly listen. Sometimes the person standing quietly in the background sees what the rest of the world overlooks. And sometimes one act of patient compassion changes far more than a single life. It changes the hearts of everyone fortunate enough to witness it.